everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're talking about something that I know a lot of you are super curious about, food additives in the US, and specifically why it seems like we have totally different rules than over in Europe.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it?
It is. We're going to be taking a look at a recent CBS News article that went pretty deep into this whole issue. And one of the things that really jumped out at me right away is, apparently there are over 950 additives that are perfectly fine to use here in the US, but are totally banned in Europe. So to help us break all this down, I've got our expert here who is like amazing at connecting the dots and helping us see the bigger picture.
Well, I think this article does a great job of highlighting how we just kind of take for granted what we see at the grocery store. Like we assume if it's on the shelf, it must be safe. But as this CBS article points out, maybe we shouldn't be so quick to trust.
Yeah, no kidding. And one of the things they kept mentioning in the article was this thing called the GRAS loophole. And I got to be honest, I wasn't totally clear on what that even meant at first.
Sorry.
GRS, it stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. But the article also called it Generally Recognized as Secret, which honestly kind of makes more sense after reading through the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, the idea behind GRS was like to simplify the process for ingredients that have a long history of safe use, right? But the way it's currently set up, companies can basically just decide for themselves if something is GRS. They don't even have to inform the FDA about it.
Seriously, they don't have to tell the FDA what they're putting in our food. That seems kind of, I don't know, a little bit off.
It's true. And the CBS article had this crazy example, too. There's this Canadian company, Psyched Wellness, and they decided that their hallucinogenic mushroom extract was GRS.
Wait, what?
Yeah, and then later the FDA had to issue a warning because, well, it
Well,
could be harmful.
so they're just putting like a hallucinogenic mushroom extract into our food without even telling the FDA. Is that what's happening?
It seems like it. And it really makes you wonder about the FDA's overall oversight when it comes to food additives.
Yeah.
Especially compared to something like pharmaceuticals, where the scrutiny is so much tighter.
Yeah.
Like, imagine if drug companies could just decide that their new medication was safe without any testing or FDA approval.
Okay, yeah. That is pretty unsettling. So, about those 950 additives allowed here that are banned in Europe, like what are some specific examples? You mentioned that Europe has a much stricter regulatory environment, right?
Right. One that comes to mind is potassium bromate. It's used in baiting a lot here in the U.S., but it's banned in a ton of other countries, including the entire EU, because there's evidence linking it to cancer.
Wow.
And even here, California is finally banning it, starting in 2027.
Well, at least that's something.
Yeah, that's a step in the right direction.
What about that titanium dioxide thing? They mentioned that in the article, too.
Oh, yeah, titanium dioxide.
Hmm.
It's used to make food look more appealing, brighter, whiter. But it's banned in the EU because there are concerns that it could potentially cause chromosomal damage.
So basically, we're being exposed to things that other countries have already decided are too risky. That's kind of a big deal, right?
It is, and it really highlights the different approaches. The EU is much more cautious. They err on the side of caution if there's any doubt about an ingredient. But here in the U.S., the system seems more reactive. Like, they often only take action after a problem has already popped up.
I'm still hung up on that whole mushroom extract thing. Like, how does the FDA even allow that level of self-regulation in the first place? It just doesn't seem like they're really putting consumer safety first. You know what I mean?
Well, it seems like they're heavily reliant on these food companies to police themselves, which is kind of,
A bit of a gamble.
yeah, exactly. The CBS article really emphasized that the FDA relies a lot on the company's own safety assessments, and they don't even have access to a lot of the research that the companies do. And then there's the fact that the FDA's own food safety director resigned because of concerns about, like, weakened oversight during the Trump administration.
That's not very reassuring.
No, not really.
So we're basically just trusting these companies to do the right thing.
Basically, yeah. And this CBS article definitely raises some questions about whether that's always the case.
So that's the GRAS loophole. That's a pretty big deal. And on top of that, you've got this whole trend of ultra-processed foods, which, let's be honest, most of us are eating pretty regularly.
Oh, absolutely. And we're talking about foods that are basically just formulated products. They rely on all kinds of chemicals and additives to achieve a certain taste or texture. And according to the article, they now make up a whopping 73% of the U.S. food supply.
73%.
Yeah, 73%. That's a lot.
That's a lot more than I would have guessed. And there were some pretty strong opinions about this in the article, even from people who are, like, politically on opposite sides, right?
Right. Both Senator Bernie Sanders and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. expressed concern about these foods. They both believe that these foods are basically designed to be addictive and that they're a huge contributor to the obesity epidemic.
And I think there was a doctor quoted in the article, too, who had similar concerns, right?
Yeah, you're thinking of Dr. Martin Makary. He was actually nominated to head up the FDA, and he said that some ingredients in ultra-processed foods can cause chronic inflammation in our digestive systems. And of course, that can lead to all sorts of health problems down the road.
So it's not just about potential risks right now, but also the long-term effects that could be happening years from now.
Exactly. And that's where things get tricky because it becomes really difficult to trace those long-term effects back to specific ingredients.
So we've got the GRAS loophole, we've got limited FDA oversight, and we've got the rise of these ultra-processed foods. It's a lot to take in.
It is.
So with all of this going on, what can we actually do? What can we do as consumers to, protect ourselves?
Well, it's easy to feel helpless in a situation like this, but it's important to remember that we're not powerless. We can make informed choices, and we can demand change.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we become more empowered?
Well, remember that KFF poll we talked about? The one where 58% of people wanted stricter limits on chemicals in food. That shows that there's a real public desire for change, for greater transparency and stricter regulations.
Yeah, and it means we're not alone in wanting this. There's power in numbers.
Absolutely. And remember the EWG database? Using tools like that to research ingredients and make informed choices at the grocery store is a great way to take back some control.
It's about being proactive, right? Not just taking what we're given, but really understanding what we're buying and putting into our bodies.
Exactly. And beyond those individual actions, we can support organizations like the EWG that are fighting for a safer food system. And of course, there's the power of the vote. We need to hold our elected officials accountable for enacting policies that put consumer health and safety first.
That's a really good point. We can support candidates who are fighting for, more transparency in the food industry, right?
Exactly. Every vote, every dollar we spend, every conversation we have about these issues sends a message. It contributes to a larger shift in the way we think about food.
You know, one of the things that really blew my mind in that CBS article was that red dye number 3 was finally banned by the FDA just this year, but it was based on research that was published all the way back in 1987. That's crazy.
Yeah, it shows how slow-moving things can be, and how important it is to keep pushing for change. Imagine how many people were exposed to that dye unnecessarily for all those years.
And then there's trichloroethylene, which is still allowed in food production, even though the EPA just banned it because it's so toxic and can cause cancer. It's like we're always playing catch up with these chemicals.
It really highlights the problems with the system.
So we can't just rely on the FDA. We have to educate ourselves and be proactive, and we need to hold our elected officials accountable. But what about the food companies themselves? They're the ones making and selling this stuff. Can we influence them directly?
I think so. Remember, these companies respond to consumer demand. If we start demanding greater transparency, cleaner ingredients, products that actually prioritize our health, they're going to have to listen.
So it's about being conscious consumers, right?
Yep.
Choosing to support the companies that are doing the right thing.
Exactly. And social media is a powerful tool, too. Online reviews, engaging with companies on their social media platforms. Companies are very image conscious. If they start seeing negative feedback about certain ingredients or practices, they're going to take notice.
It's about using our voices, leaving reviews, writing letters, even making phone calls. It all makes a difference.
It does. And don't forget the power of community. Supporting local farmers markets, sharing information with friends and family, it all adds up.
It's about taking an active role, right? Not just being a passive consumer, but really being a part of shaping the food system we want to see.
Exactly. And the first step is recognizing that we have that power.
Okay, so we've talked about individual action, we've talked about putting pressure on the companies, but what about the bigger picture? What kind of systemic changes would you like to see to make the food system safer in the long run?
Well, for starters, I think we need to completely rethink this whole GRAS system. It's just not working. Companies shouldn't be able to self-regulate like this. We need more transparency and independent oversight. Like you said earlier, maybe we should be looking more towards how Europe does things.
You mentioned the precautionary principle, right? Where if there's any doubt about an ingredient, it's just not allowed.
Exactly. It seems so straightforward, but it's not how things work here.
And what about increased funding for the FDA? The article mentioned that they often don't have the resources to properly oversee this huge food industry.
Yeah, that's a big problem. If we want the FDA to do its job effectively, They need to have the resources to do it. That means more funding for independent research, monitoring ingredients, enforcing regulations. It's common sense, but it seems like it's not always a priority.
It all comes down to politics in the end, I guess.
It does. And that's where we come in as citizens. We need to demand that our elected officials prioritize our health and safety over corporate profits.
So it's a multi-pronged approach. Individual action, collective action, and pushing for systemic change. It all works together.
It does. And I think this conversation is a great starting point for understanding how complex this issue is and how we can start to make a difference.
I agree. But before we get into specific strategies for making change, we've got to address one more crucial aspect of all this.
So we just finished talking about how messed up the whole food additive situation is here in the U.S. Especially compared to Europe, it seems like we're way behind. So the big question is, what can we actually do about it? As consumers, I mean. How do we actually push for some real change here?
I know, right? It's easy to feel like, what difference can I really make? But like you were saying before, we do have power as consumers. It's just a matter of like how to use it effectively, right?
Absolutely. And I think this CBS article does a good job of laying out some different ways we can actually make a difference. Like, remember that KFF poll we talked about, where 58% of people said they wanted stricter limits on chemicals in food? That right there shows that people want change. They want more transparency and better regulation. It's not just a few of us who are worried about this.
Yeah, it's like you said, knowledge is power. The more we know about what's going on, the more we can demand better. And that poll just shows that we're not alone in wanting to see some changes.
Exactly. And speaking of knowledge, we also talked about tools like the EWG database. Using those kinds of resources to actually research ingredients and make more informed decisions at the grocery store, that's a big step in the right direction.
It's about being proactive, not just blindly trusting what's put in front of us, but actually taking the time to understand what we're buying and eating.
Exactly. And beyond what we can do individually, we can also support organizations like the EWG that are working to make the food system safer for everybody, donating to their research, spreading the word about their work, things like that.
Right. And of course, there's always the power of voting, making sure we're supporting candidates who are actually going to prioritize consumer health and safety.
Right. Like supporting candidates who are actually going to push for more transparency and stricter regulations in the food industry.
It's about making our voices heard in every way we can.
Exactly. Every vote, every dollar we spend, even just talking about these issues with our friends and family, it all sends a message. It helps shift the whole conversation.
I mean, that whole thing with red dye number 3, it finally got banned this year, but it was based on research from like 1987. That's crazy.
I know, right? It shows you how slow-moving the bureaucracy can be and how important it is to keep the pressure on. Imagine how many people were eating that dye all those years, not knowing it could be harmful.
And then there's trichloroethylene, which is still being used in food production, even though the EPA just banned it because it's so toxic. It's mind-boggling.
It's a perfect example of how flawed the system is,
So we can't rely on the FDA to protect us. We have to be proactive, educate ourselves, hold our elected officials accountable. But what about the food companies themselves? I mean, they're the ones making and selling these products. Is there any way to influence them directly?
I think there is.
Yeah.
These companies, they respond to consumer demand.
Yeah.
It's all about the bottom line for them. So we start demanding greater transparency. If we start demanding cleaner ingredients, if we're choosing to buy products that prioritize health over profit, they're going to have to listen.
So it's about voting with our wallets,
Yeah.
right? Supporting the companies that are actually doing the right thing.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of things like social media and online reviews. Companies are super sensitive to their public image these days. If they start seeing negative feedback about certain ingredients or practices, they're going to have to take notice.
It's not just about what we buy. It's about letting our voices be heard, right? Leaving reviews, engaging with companies on social media, writing letters, even making phone calls. It all adds up.
It does. And don't forget about the power of community, too. Supporting local farmers markets, buying from businesses that use clean ingredients, sharing information with friends and family, it all creates this ripple effect.
Yeah, it's about being a part of something bigger, right? It's
Yeah.
not just about individual choices. It's about being part of a movement.
Exactly. It all starts with realizing that we actually have a lot more power than we think.
So we've talked about taking action as individuals, putting pressure on companies, but what about the big picture, What are some of the systemic changes that need to happen to really make our food system safer in the long run?
Well, that GRS system we talked about, that's a big one. It needs to be completely overhauled. Companies shouldn't be allowed to just decide for themselves what's safe. Like you said, maybe we need to look to Europe as an example.
You mentioned the precautionary principle, right? Where they
Hmm.
basically say if there's any doubt about an ingredient, it's just not allowed in food.
Exactly. It's so simple, but it makes so much sense. But that's not how it works here.
And what about the FDA? I mean, they're obviously underfunded and understaffed.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. If we
Yeah.
want them to do their job properly, they need the resources to do it. More funding for research, for monitoring, for enforcing regulations. It shouldn't even be a question, really.
It's common sense, but it always seems to come down to politics and money.
It does, unfortunately. And that's why we need to be active and vocal citizens. We need to demand that our elected officials prioritize our health and safety over corporate profits.
So it's about a multi-pronged approach, right?
Yeah.
Individual action, collective action, and pushing for those bigger systemic changes. It all works together.
It does. And I think this conversation's a great foundation for understanding how complex this whole issue really is and how we can start to make a difference.
I agree. But before we get into specific strategies for pushing for change, there's one more really important piece of this puzzle we need to talk about. Okay, so we've talked about all the things we can do as individuals, how to put pressure on the companies, and even pushing for bigger changes in the system. But it all comes back to this one question, like, what do we actually want our food system to look like?
Yeah, that's really the heart of it, isn't it? We can talk about regulations and ingredients all day long, but at the end of the day, it's about what kind of food system we want to support. You know, one that prioritizes our health, our communities, our planet.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think that's such an important question to keep in mind. It's not just about avoiding this additive or that ingredient. It's about like taking a step back and really asking ourselves, what kind of food system do we want to be a part of?
And what role do we want to play in creating that system? Because
Right.
like we've been saying, we do have power as individuals, as communities, as citizens. We can vote with our dollars, we can make our voices heard, and we can vote for change.
One of the things that really hit home for me in the CBS article was how disconnected we've become from our food. Like, we're so reliant on these huge corporations to produce and process what we eat, and we often have no idea where our food actually comes from or what's actually in it.
Yeah, that's a huge part of the problem. And I think part of the solution is about reclaiming that connection. It's about supporting local farmers, learning to cook more at home, actually understanding where our food comes from and what we're putting into our bodies.
It's about shifting our mindset, right? Going from being passive consumers to being active participants in our food system.
Exactly. And that can look different for everybody. Maybe it means growing your own herbs or joining a community garden or just being more thoughtful about where you buy your groceries.
Right. It's all about taking those little steps. Every choice we make adds up.
Exactly. It all creates this ripple effect that can actually lead to real change.
I gotta say, this whole deep dive has been really eye-opening for me. I've learned so much, and honestly, it's a little scary, but it's also empowering, you know? Like, now I feel like I can actually do something about it.
I think that's the most important thing, that sense of empowerment. We don't have to just sit back and accept a system that's not working for us. We can demand better.
So to wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. We've learned so much about the potential risks of certain additives, about how the system works, and maybe where it's broken. So, what do you think? What role should we as consumers play in advocating for a safer and healthier food system?
It's a big question, and I think it starts with each of us individually. We need to educate ourselves, we need to understand the issues, and then we need to take action. Whether that's making different choices at the grocery store or supporting organizations that are fighting for change or making our voices heard and demanding more transparency and accountability from the food industry and our elected officials. Creating a healthier food system is going to take all of us working together.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We hope you learned something new and that you're feeling inspired to take action. We'll see you next time.